Hello, friends. Welcome back to the cabin. My name is Tim Martin with Covenant Creation on YouTube. It's a cold winter day outside, but things will be warming up today with this episode in the 2024 Covenant Creation curriculum series. We've taken a look at the covenant context for Thorns and Thistles in redemptive history. That was part one, section one of this series. And we've also laid a foundation for sound biblical hermeneutics in order to understand what the Bible means by what it says. That was part one, section two. Today we come to part one, section three, and this section is designed to use those principles to re-examine mankind as one key portion or part of the covenant population in the Bible. Now, let me start here with a text that I used last time from Revelation chapter 9, verse 18, where we read this: by these three plagues, a third of mankind was killed by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone which came out of their mouths. The word here for mankind is anthropos, and our modern conception of the word mankind is shaped by Renaissance and Enlightenment thinking as the totality of human beings in general. So all human beings in the world make up a category that we call mankind in our common language use. It's a generic understanding. And usually this is given as the definition of the Greek word anthropos in the Bible as simply humans without any qualification or context. Now, this is the modern conception that is captured, for example, in the Declaration of Independence, where we read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." So the context for that statement is legal and governmental, but it is the modern cultural application based on a generic understanding of mankind as all human beings in general, at least in theory, if not in practice, as we see in American history related to Black Americans or Native Americans since the founding of the United States. But is that modern post-Enlightenment generic humanity definition the biblical meaning for the Greek word anthropos and its translation as mankind? Does mankind in the Bible mean all of humanity as a whole, as we think of it in a post-Enlightenment and post-Renaissance world? Well, this is actually a hermeneutical question that divides the debate over eschatology between futurism and preterism in this text in Revelation chapter 9. Futurists who deny first century fulfillment of Revelation believe a modern definition for mankind in Revelation 9, and that modern definition of mankind matches their view of heaven and earth as planet Earth and the universe. So they would say there is coming a global great tribulation where 1/3 of all human beings will be killed as literal fulfillment of this text. So the context here for futurism is universal and global according to their literalism. It is simply the literal hermeneutic in action. But if Revelation 9 has already been fulfilled in the first century, then obviously the definition for mankind, or anthropos in the Greek, must be understood in a covenant context related to the Jewish wars and defined as Israelites. And I do realize here that Revelation is apocalyptic genre, and so the numbers and symbols may not be exact in any arithmetic sense. Yet the question remains about the biblical meaning of mankind in places like Revelation chapter 9. Who is being slaughtered here, historically speaking? Is it the global population that's in view, or is it Israel with a covenant judgment that's the context of these depictions from Revelation chapter 9? So the question that should come to our mind is this question: if we understand how biblical hermeneutics works, we should ask, how is mankind, or anthropos, used elsewhere in our scripture, in the Bible? Can the preterist view of mankind with a covenant context related to Israel be justified, just as heaven and earth refers to a covenant world centered in Israel? So no one's going to argue that a significant portion of humanity, or even 1/3 of the Roman Empire, was killed in the Jewish wars in the first century. That's not really a legitimate option. Nobody really would argue that. But what about the Greek word anthropos? Are preterists asking for a covenant definition of anthropos in Revelation chapter 9 with biblical warrant, or are they guilty of special pleading, wanting a random exception for anthropos in Revelation 9 to fit their past fulfillment doctrine? So that's the question that we will start this with. Now, a few years ago, I preached a lengthy sermon series through the book of Mark, and those audio sermons are available in a playlist here on Covenant Creation on YouTube. I'll leave a link in the description. But I examined this issue of the biblical meaning of anthropos as I engaged in deep study through Mark, and I found some examples that are very helpful. Let's take a look at one of these examples where we read that Jesus had a conflict with the Pharisees early on in his ministry, and that illuminates this issue on a profound way if we think through the details. One Sabbath day, Jesus and his disciples walked through a wheat field and plucked heads of grain to eat because they were hungry. Do you remember Jesus' response? After referencing David, who ate the priest's bread, we read, "And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man," that's anthropos, same word as Revelation chapter 9, "and not man," anthropos again, "for the Sabbath." So let me ask you a simple question here as you think about that story in Mark. Was the Sabbath made for all of mankind in the Old Testament, or was the Sabbath specifically made for Israel? Well, consider what the Old Testament says here. In Exodus 31, we read, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations." We see something very similar in Isaiah 56, where we read, "Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant." So was the Sabbath made for all human beings generically, according to the scripture, according to the law and prophets? No, actually. According to the law, the Sabbath was given to Israel as a sign of God's covenant with them. So the Sabbath equals Israel's covenant. Yet Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for anthropos, mankind, the exact same word again that is in Revelation 9:18. So there is one demonstration that in the New Testament it is at least plausible for mankind to be limited to a covenant context with Israel. The Sabbath law context for Jesus' statement provides one very interesting proof if you think about the details in the Old Testament. Now, I also have here the connection between the seventh day of Genesis 1 and Israel as highlighted by Hebrews 4, which brings Genesis 1, the seventh day of creation, and Israel's history together in context. Watch how the writer of Hebrews does this. He says, "For he has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works." Reference to Genesis 1, which in context is with Adam. "And again in this place, they shall not enter my rest." Psalm 95, which is a reference to Israel. Now, do you remember the example from Thorns and Thistles, how Hebrews 6, 7, and 8 brought the language of Genesis 3:18 and Adam together with Deuteronomy 32 and Israel? Well, here's another example of that method from Hebrews, where day 7 and the context of Adam is brought together with the history of Israel as one unified whole, according to Hebrews 4, 4-5. So Mark's example of the Sabbath made for mankind relates to the wider theology of Sabbath rooted in Genesis chapter 1, according to Hebrews 4. So we could summarize the biblical connections drawn from these texts like this. Sabbath is Israel's covenant. Sabbath was made for man, according to Jesus. Therefore, man, or anthropos, equals Adam, Israel, as a united whole. And the theology is a little bit deeper too, because Sabbath is a type of salvation rest in Jesus Christ that is about the salvation. So does that throw some helpful light on the use of anthropos in Revelation 9 as related to Israel? I think it does, and it shows that a careful reading of Anthropos yields a covenant context, especially in Mark chapter 2. Now, here's another example. Moving on in Mark, we have this example where we read, "For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do." Now, this is anthropos, but it's in the plural, same Greek word with it in the plural. But this is an example that cannot mean generic humanity in context. What were the traditions of men that Jesus confronted in this context? Well, it was the tradition of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. So once again, we find an example here that if you study the context about what's going on in the gospel text, we're dealing with Israel. Here's one more example for you. This one is from Mark chapter 8. Remember Jesus' response to Peter? You probably remember the story after Jesus began telling his disciples that he would be handed over to be killed and would rise again after 3 days. We read this account. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when he had turned around and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." Exact same word again as Revelation chapter 9. But Jesus rebukes Peter because Peter had responded from the Jewish mindset common in his day. Peter believed that Messiah would be a political ruler to rise to power and overthrow the Roman government and establish a physical kingdom, just like all the other nations. So Jesus was not talking at all about generic humanity in his rebuke of Peter, but it was addressing Peter's Jewish worldview and error. These were the ideas of men in the context of this story. So those three examples from Mark alone show that a covenant context for mankind in Revelation 9 is certainly reasonable. And there could be investigation about how anthropos is used in the rest of the New Testament, including, the epistles with Paul and Peter and the book of Jude. But let me just say it is an interesting study, to say the least, when you examine this certain use all the way across the New Testament. But it wasn't just Jesus who understood this. Let's also look at this example of how biblical authors who follow this association of mankind related to Israel in that ancient cultural context. Do you remember the discussion when a Gentile woman came to ask for healing from Jesus, the Messiah of Israel? Note what imagery applies to non-Israelites and what imagery applies to Israelites in the context of that exchange. Again, Mark chapter 7. For a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said to her, "Let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." And she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For this saying, go your way, the demon has gone out of your daughter." Now, who are the mankind in this discussion? Jesus is talking about the children being fed bread first, and then the bread will go to the waiting animals. And how intriguing is that discussion in terms of covenant population? It's not really a denigrating use of the animal metaphor that we are used to in our post-Enlightenment and modern conceptions. Of course, that's how we think of animals, and we use them to degrade individuals or be an insult to individuals when we use animals referring to people. But this was just accepted as the way it was during this ancient world, and it was the way the metaphors worked. Also note here that Jesus does not say that the animals get no bread. No, he says the children must eat first, and this account fits very nicely with the wider New Testament pattern that the gospel goes to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles afterwards. And in this discussion, the Jews are the man children, while the Gentiles are some sort of animal. And again, it's not a derogatory insult. In her case, she acknowledges her place in the old covenant world, and she is blessed because of her humility and faith. And so there's a little bit of a hint to where I am going with this whole covenant population theme. The bread from heaven is going to go to the animals after the children are fed first. All of God's covenant creation is going to be fed the bread of life in due time. And this is actually the message of the history recorded in the book of Acts. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. If you want to see how that plays out in the book of Acts, I did a sermon series through the book of Acts. I'll also put the link in the description. This episode is about covenant population and mankind. We'll get there soon enough. Well, this issue of anthropos in the New Testament has roots like everything else in the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, the Hebrew has 3 different words translated into English as man or mankind. Adam is a covenant man under God, usually related to a Hebrew, Israelite, Jewish context, which is a broad Hebrew word for humans in general or common to humanity as a whole. There's Enosh, which is humanity described in a mortal or weak state and condition. And usually this is related somewhat to Ish. But the differences here are not biological. It's not using the words defined by races or biology in any sense. This is borne out in the examples that I'll show you in a moment. But the nuance has to do with covenant function. Now, which word do you think is used of the 3 Hebrew words in Genesis 1:27 with God's creation? Adam, Ish, Enosh. Well, if you said Adam, then you're right. It is Adam, the same name used in Genesis 2 in the garden scene that follows well. And that's because the story is all one story and the same person and the same name. But for some odd reason, English translators often render Adam as man in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and they render Ish as man elsewhere in the Old Testament, and they render Enosh as man or mankind in the Old Testament without any differentiation to completely different Hebrew words. And a great deal of confusion behind the issue of mankind in the Old Testament springs from the fact that all 3 of these Hebrew words are translated as man or mankind into English as if they are complete synonyms in Hebrew. And the result, of course, is that the English reader of the Hebrew Old Testament has no clue which Hebrew word lies behind the English translation. In fact, it's so bad that most casual readers of the Old Testament don't even know that there are 3 different Hebrew words in the Old Testament that are all translated and all lie behind equally, the English rendering of man or mankind. I mean, it's as if our modern Bible has been translated from the post-Enlightenment mindset and cultural conceptions of mankind as some kind of generic category for human beings in general, sort of like that all men of the Declaration of Independence, rather than the nuance and detail that exists plainly in the ancient Hebrew. Do you think that method of translating all 3 Hebrew words as identical in English might create some bias for the modern reader of the Old Testament? I mean, yeah, I think so, just a little bit. I mean, our current situation is problematic, to say the least. And to think about this issue, preterists already understand this very same issue as related to the New Testament studies. When there are 3 different Greek words, for example, eon, cosmos, and oikomenes, that are all translated as the same English word in the New Testament as world. They're all world. Yet we know that eon for age does not mean the same as cosmos, and neither of those words mean the same thing as oikomenes, the inhabited world of the Roman Empire. Yet they all get rendered as the same English word for world across our New Testament, and the result is chaos and confusion for the normal reader of the New Testament. That we preterists have to go back and we have to explain. These are different words, they have different meanings. Well, the very same issue applies for English translations of the Hebrew Old Testament regarding Adam, Ish, and Enosh. So those details regarding the Hebrew words are important. And I believe we have a lot of study ahead of us to look closely at the way that those 3 words are used in the Old Testament. And that study is going to lead to some significant implications for theology of the New Testament as Milton Terry suggested long ago, as we saw in our previous section, mainly due to the unity of Scripture and the connection between the Hebraic mindset so obviously evident among the writers of the New Testament. So what I'm saying here is if we have a different nuance in the Old Testament of these different Hebrew words, it's going to have some major implications across the theology of the New Testament. But here's my conclusion on the matter. I believe it can be demonstrated that Adam, Ish, and Enosh are not synonyms in the Old Testament. And furthermore, what we have seen regarding the Adam-Israel link itself has profound implications to improve our understanding of the Bible in its own original culture and context. Let me give you an example of this. For example, consider the phrase that Jesus used often about himself, rendered as Son of Man in our Bibles. Well, that's how our English Bibles render the translation. Again, we think of generic humanity and some kind of post-enlightenment concepts. But that phrase rooted in and Daniel. Now, which Hebrew word would you expect to be found in all the antecedents for the Son of Man phrase? I mean, pretty obvious, isn't it? I mean, in every example of that phrase in the Old Testament, the word for man is Adam. So when Jesus uses that phrase over and over and over again, following Ezekiel and Daniel, please realize the Hebrew reads son of Adam. It's not some generic humanity reference. It's an explicit link, son of Adam, all the way back to Genesis 1:27. It's not son of Abraham. as if the story of Jesus begins with the code of Abraham. It's not son of Moses. It's son of Adam, rooted through the law and the prophets all the way back to Genesis 1:27. Now consider these two examples of how this works in the Old Testament. This is just an illustrative example from the book of Daniel that I noticed while I studied and preached my way through a sermon series in Daniel a few years ago. That playlist is in the description. But watch how the language of Adam and Ish in Daniel plays out with this contrasting example. Faithful Daniel, on one hand, is presented as a true son of Adam. So he came near to where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of Adam, that the vision refers to the time of the end. Now, in Daniel 8, the context of the end is related to the end of the age and matches the same covenant context that we see in Revelation chapter 9 with Israel and the covenant judgment on the land. But the language son of Adam is used of Daniel, the faithful representative of Israel. Now compare that to the language Daniel uses in his confession of sin and his priestly prayer on behalf of his people, Israel, in the very next chapter. Daniel writes, O Lord, righteousness belongs to you, but to us shame of face, as it is this day, to the men Ish of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and all Israel, those near and those far off in all the countries to which you have driven them, because of the unfaithfulness which they have committed against you. I mean, that's fascinating. All of Israel and all the countries, including Assyria and the northern kingdom, which Daniel brings into the context, are Ish, not Adam. I mean, if you think about that contrast, it's almost like they lose their glory of their creation and calling due to the unfaithfulness, and they become just like the common human beings around them when they broke covenant and were cast out of their land. I find that to be a fascinating example to illustrate the nuance of those Hebrew words. Daniel does not use them randomly without any covenant purpose. So if this is a more accurate understanding of the Hebrew words, then we can conclude that the theological flow of the scripture narrative goes from Adam to Israel as a united corporate body during the old covenant creation. And then Jesus becomes the last Adam and is connected to the church as the Israel of God in fulfillment with the new covenant. Continuing on here, lest you think that I'm making all of this up, my explanation above regarding these different Hebrew words for man will lead to all sorts of new questions and fresh options to explore. But I want to conclude this episode with a few examples of how recent scholarship is now discovering the significance of the covenant context of the ancient Hebrew language for an accurate understanding of the biblical narrative. There is a nuance here that is now being recognized. This example comes from James B. Jordan. He says that Adam, as used in the Hebrew scriptures, seems to connote mankind as considered united to Adam. It does not quite mean human beings in general. And that's kind of an awkward quote for Jordan because, Jordan is a young earth creationist and he has presuppositions about mankind and Adam, sort of unexamined assumptions about Genesis 1 as material creation, the physical universe, etc., that don't allow him to really investigate that, that significance. And maybe it betrays a little bit that Jordan doesn't want to investigate the detail. I mean, he almost senses that the investigation might lead to some, shall we say, transformational doctrinal conclusions. But we could boil it all down to the observation that in the ancient Hebrew language, Adam, Ish, Enosh, those examples, works this way. All Adams are Ish, but not all Ish are Adams. I mean, think about that for a while. That kind of sort of sums up the distinction. All Adams are Ish, but not all Ish are Adams. Another example from wider scholarship that shows some striking movement in the direction of this approach is from G.K. Beale, who offers this explanation. G.K. Beale writes, the reason that Jesus reflects both the Old Testament figures of Adam and Israel is because, as we have seen earlier, Israel and her patriarchs are given the same commission as was Adam in Genesis 1:26 through 28. Consequently, it is not an overstatement to understand Israel as a corporate Adam who had failed in their Garden of Eden, in much the same way as their primal father had failed in the first. For the reasons, it is understandable that Jesus is called Son of God, partly because that was a name for the first Adam, according to Luke chapter 3, verse 38, and for Israel in Exodus chapter 4, verse 22. Likewise, the expression Son of Man from Daniel refers to end-time Israel and her representative king as the son of Adam, who is sovereign over the beasts. Understandably, against this background, it is natural that Son of Man, that's Adam, became one of Jesus's favorite ways of referring to himself. That is a very full quote. Israel is a corporate body of Adam? I mean, there is some powerful insight in there that leads logically toward a preterist view, particularly a corporate body view of resurrection, right? And note again the connection in Beale's description between Adam and Israel, something that I've been highlighting in our series so far. We've seen direct texts like Hebrews 4 through 5 and Hebrews 6, 7, and 8. There are many others across the New Testament as well. God's son is Adam, according to Luke 3:38, but Israel was known explicitly as God's son in Exodus 4:22 and the story of Moses and Pharaoh. So Adam and Israel are related in the story. And now we're talking about some very key associations for the covenant creation approach. And it is being laid out here by G.K. Beale, one of the most preeminent modern conservative Christian theologians today. I should probably add here that we suggested this development in our book, Beyond Creation Science, back in 2007, where we explained many Christians in our day insist that the flood, Babel, and prophecy reference global events. Preterism introduces a key principle of covenant context that offers a coherent understanding of Noah's flood, the Tower of Babel, and New Testament prophecy. Preterism may very well revolutionize the Genesis. And I'd stay here as we develop in the thinking of covenant creation. The issue of covenant context not only provides a fresh look at the historical details of events in covenant history, it also provides a fresh theological paradigm for understanding Adam's role in the Old Covenant creation. And we will investigate this covenant context applied to Adam and Israel in upcoming episodes of this series. But for now, I would just point out that that explanation from G.K. Beale and James Jordan and Beyond Creation Science offers a fascinating look at how covenant creation develops naturally from the principles of preterism. In this case, for this episode focused on covenant population of mankind, there is a domino effect starting with Revelation 9:18 and 1/3 of mankind being destroyed in covenant judgment. And this domino effect, just one domino falls right off of the next one, all the way back through the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, to offer a fresh look at Adam beginning in Genesis 1:27. And I'll give you an example, sort of a preview of an idea of where this all goes with the upcoming next segment in this series. The issue of covenant population is not limited to mankind because covenant creation is not an Israel-only view of covenant history. So here's a look at where we go in this next episode. We have the 2024 Covenant Creation Curriculum Series, Part 1, Section 4, coming up next. Covenant population, the animals. Thanks for watching. If you found this study helpful, please like and subscribe to this channel. The next episode is coming soon. Until then, I am Tim Martin with Covenant Creation on YouTube. Blessings.